Hello everyone, I am Taiwo James Ayeni. Welcome to News Analysis. In recent news, President-elect Donald Trump has shocked the world with his nominations. Elon Musk, Matt Gaetz, and now
turn to some breaking news, though. Sources tell NBC News that the president-elect, Donald Trump, is expected to pick Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Trump had previously promised RFK a, quote, big role after RFK abandoned his independent bid for president and endorsed Donald Trump. The New York Times describes him like this, as a, quote, environmental lawyer who has no medical or public health degrees and has promoted anti-vaccine conspiracies for years, end quote. Regarding the Food and Drug Administration, the agency that is responsible for the safety of our prescriptions, vaccines, cosmetics, our food, even veterinary medicine, an agency that would be under his purview, RFK has said that, quote, entire departments have to go. Let's bring into our breaking news coverage former Obama White House Policy Director, MSNBC medical contributor, Dr. Kavita Patel. Dr. Patel, your first reaction.
Oh, my God. I mean, those of us who have spent our lifetime, kind of decades working in and around in HHS, I'm not kidding, Nicole, my texts are flying off the chain, both Democrats and Republicans saying, this can't be real. Someone must have gotten this wrong. This can't be possible. And now the second underlying chain, if there's some silver linings, the second thought I had is he can't get confirmed, can he? But I'm just listening to you talk about the DNI and all these other roles that require some sort of White House or confirmation or some combination. And here we are. It is really hard to believe. There are career staff texting me saying this was just the push they needed to try to get out. They were already on the fence and worried. We're not just going to see this incredible kind of integration of ideology that has no science behind it. But Nicole, we're going to see probably the best of the best career staff leaving these agencies potentially hollow that he would oversee.
Just for people that aren't familiar with how HHS interacts with the medical community and people's lives, just take us through a little bit of that, if you will.
Yeah, so the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as you mentioned, has a purview over many agencies that touch our lives. You just touched on a couple of them: Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. You may kind of know these letters as we've talked about all vaccines and things during COVID, but it touches everything. Nicole, it touches our food supply chain. I'll give you an example. When we had a supply chain shortage of baby formula, this hits a lot of people at home because none of the shelves could keep the formula stocked. It's the HHS secretary who kind of pulled it all together and worked with other departments to try to make sure that we could get Americans formula just to feed their children. Add into that just all the research. Think of the National Institutes of Health, Nicole, that's also under HHS. Research on drug development. And I actually pulled up, just to remind myself, a tweet from RFK Jr. when he was running for president, where he said that if he were president, I guess thank goodness he's not, he'd stop research on drug development and infectious diseases for 8 years. And I think he was proud of that. So anything that you do in the medical community, and then let me tell you where it hits home. During COVID, you and I have talked about the Medical Reserve Corps and the Public Health Service Agency, all the people who actually help to facilitate getting vaccines across the country, getting COVID tests across the country, that's under HHS as well. So anything from a safety net clinic to the medicines that you trust are safe, that is now potentially going to be under this environmental lawyer with no training whatsoever and very dangerous views.
I have a little one, so I'm on a vaccine schedule again, and I trust my pediatrician with that. RFK has criticized childhood vaccination schedules, linked vaccines to autism and other health issues against studies. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky warned in 2022 that vaccine misinformation is one of the biggest threats to children's health. In the sort of pickled community of anti-vax disinformation, there are people that refuse vaccines, and there are outbreaks of polio and measles in this country, diseases that were once thought eradicated. What should people watching do if they have young kids?
I do think that if there is any solace, it's what you just said, that as as doctors, we're trained. So we are trained. I know that we've talked about doctors in many states not being allowed to talk about certain issues. I really hope and pray that vaccines and public health do not become another set of issues in addition to reproductive and women's health. But right now, your pediatricians, your primary care doctors, they have your best interest. They treat you in front of them, and they're not worried about the politics. In fact, I bet most of my medical colleagues don't even realize what's happening because they're doing what they should be doing and taking care of people. So I do think that it's worth just having that direct conversation with your pediatrician. And I also do encourage people to look at the evidence. I do not try to dismiss people when they talk to me about concerns about vaccines, but it's worth bringing back up that initial study that has been since debunked and refuted. And in fact, journals have retracted any of the mentions, not because they're afraid, but because we want to put good science forward. And Nicole, I'm all for telling you that we could probably do things differently. I know that I've talked with my own pediatrician, with my children about, do we need to do all of these vaccines in this one visit? Can we spread it across 2 visits? All of those conversations are appropriate, but that is not what we're talking about. That's not what RFK Jr. is talking about. He's talking about implying a direct causality between vaccines and autism. And in addition to that, other claims that we have. And then he couches it by saying he's not anti-vax. He's just anti all the vaccines that we currently have, which is effectively being anti-vaccine.
Let me do 2 things. Let me show you Trump's mandate that he gave RFK and told him to, quote, go wild. And let me bring into our coverage Vaughn Hilliard. First, Donald Trump.
I'm going to let him go wild on health. I'm going to let him go wild on the food. I'm going to let him go wild on medicines. The only thing I told him, though, Bobby, you got to do one thing, do whatever you want. You just go ahead, work on the pesticides, work on making the women's health. He's so into women's health. And, you know, he's really unbelievable. It's such a passion.
Vaughn Hilliard joins our coverage. Vaughn, take us inside your reporting on how this came to be.
Right. It was just last week that he suggested to me here in Palm Beach, number one, that he was going to actually live here in Palm Beach throughout the next months, throughout the course of the transition, because he wanted to be close to the operation and as helpful as he could be. And I asked him about the HHS secretary role. Of course, there were questions of whether he would be able to be confirmed by the Senate. And he had suggested to me that he was actually interested in a role of a White House health czar, which, of course, would allow him to be inside the White House without having to be confirmed by the Senate. But as he just played from those bites, Donald Trump was very specific that he would let him do whatever he wanted, including on vaccines. And I think that this is a year-plus long conversation that we've been having with Mr. Kennedy. And it was one that last week I directly asked him about when it came to vaccines, because as Dr. Patel and you guys were just talking about, he says he is not anti-vax, just anti the vaccines that are on the market here today. And back during the COVID pandemic, he was very public in his opposition to the FDA granting emergency authorization for Americans' access to the multiple and various COVID vaccines that were brought to the market. And last week I asked him whether he, inside of the White House, overseeing the FDA, would seek to use the FDA to block such authorization if there was another pandemic or as new vaccines come to the market, or whether he would seek to remove any vaccines from the market. And interestingly, he followed up and told me that he would not do either of those, that he would not block any new vaccines and would not pull any from the market. Instead, he said that he would ensure that all Americans have all of the access to information. Of course, there's a lot to unpack there, and you are taking Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s words after decades of work fighting vaccines from being available to Americans on the market. And the second part of that was from our interview, Nicole. I asked very specifically the question of him, too, of whether he would seek to remove a part of the civil federal workforce working at these 13 different health agencies under HHS, including the CDC. And he told me that he would, in fact, seek to even eliminate some departments, including the nutrition department. Now, of course, there is a large conversation about health in America, and he has attracted a large following of people who are concerned about ingredients and sugar and American food products and drink products. But then there's that next part of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that is undoubtedly going to get questions from including Republican senators on Capitol Hill, and that's his posture on vaccines, especially coming off of a time in which Americans just lived through a pandemic under the Trump administration.
Today, we have added the Secretary of State, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, the NASA Administrator, the head of the Forest Service, and the President's personal assistant. We have gone to the big wall and 3 columns. Anybody else going tonight? There needs to be a new director of the CIA as well. And now tonight, the National Security Advisor is out too. And so, yeah, we're going to need another wall soon.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. One of the hallmarks of the first Trump administration was our friend and dear colleague Rachel Maddow and her wall, her giant wall, keeping tabs on and listing all of the many people who left the White House under Trump, often under duress, often fired after a blow-up, many of them unceremoniously fired on Twitter by the ex-president himself for not giving him exactly what he wanted. We share that blast from the past, that time capsule with you, because this time it's not clear that Rachel's going to need a wall, and maybe not one that big, because Donald Trump is now surrounding himself with the kind of people who would never have any tension with him, the kind of people who only say yes, people whose only qualification for the kinds of jobs they're getting are that feature, that fact, that they're loyal only to him, not the Constitution, not the expertise once associated with the agencies they've been tapped to lead. Just take the most recent cabinet picks: a Fox News weekend morning show anchor to head the Department of Defense, a former Democratic congresswoman who publicly spreads Russian talking points, who has been now tapped to lead the nation's spy agencies, and a man who was the target of a years-long federal sex trafficking investigation to lead the Department of Justice. And of course, the breaking news we just brought you in the last hour: a world-famous anti-vaccine activist, Robert Kennedy Jr., to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Of course, the choices still have to come to pass, either bypass Senate confirmation or, by some ultimate humiliation of the Republicans in the Senate, be confirmed by the Senate. But as the New York Times editorial board writes, quote, Trump clearly expects the Senate to simply roll over and ignore its responsibilities. He wants to turn the leaders of major important agencies into his deputies, remaking the federal government into a Trump Inc. org chart entirely subordinate to him. He recently demanded that the Senate give him the ability to make recess appointments, a way of bypassing the Senate's consent process when the chamber is adjourned for 10 days or more. And it's not just the positions at the top of the agencies that Trump is filling with unqualified yes men and women. He has threatened to purge these departments of civil servants who he believes are not loyal enough to him. The Republican Party has already demonstrated over the last 9 years that they almost always let him have his way with whatever his attention demands. Here's Congressman Troy Nehls of Texas yesterday, right after Trump spoke to the House Republican caucus.
Donald Trump he was in there. Everybody loves listening to him. He could have sat in there for another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and we'd all be listening attentively. He's the greatest thing since sliced bread. If Donald Trump says jump 3 feet high and scratch your head, we all jump 3 feet high and scratch our heads. That's it.
At least they admit it now, year 9. It is sort of a helpful feature. So we're going to forget about the Constitution, the guiding principle of the country and the Republican Party, and replace it with Donald Trump. Liz Cheney warned us we are slow walking into autocracy, although at the rate this week is going, it looks more like we are running. It's where we start the hour with the host of the Rachel Maddow Show right here on MSNBC, New York Times bestselling author, my colleague and dear friend, Rachel Maddow's here. Rachel, where to start? You go.
Well, I don't know. I don't know where to start. I mean, I do feel like, Nicole, that you, maybe more than anyone, has been very clear-eyed about what was coming and about what was being promised here, and that there was no reason to expect this to be moderated or normal, or that this is going to tack back toward the center or towards anything that looked like traditional American politics. I mean, you did your Autocracy in America series, and listen, we saw what was going to happen, and now it is happening. And so I do feel like this is a moment for people to get real and for people to stop saying, like, oh, this is going to end up being much more moderate than anybody expected. When are you going to stop? So when are you going to start apologizing for saying that democracy was threatened? I mean, I think it's time to get real and realize that this is really what we're up against. But I also think the fact that we all feel a little bit, I don't know if flummoxed is the right word, sort of rocked by the increasing incredulity of these choices, is that it is meant to shock us. It's meant to adjust our sense of what is normal, what is possible, and to sort of so disorient us as to what it counts to propose governance in the United States that we're ready for the most radical pronouncements and actions. And I do think we're supposed to feel the way that we do right now. I think that's part of this. It's a shock and awe campaign against American traditions and mores. And that's, I think, how most of the country feels about it.
I mean, I think to sort of sustain the military analysis, the Iraq War starts with a shock and awe bombing campaign. The war is a catastrophe. I mean, it doesn't connote competence. It doesn't signal that he will succeed in successfully demolishing American democracy. It does mean that we as a press still, every single time, chase the shiny object. And this week, the shiny objects are named Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard, and RFK Jr. Next week, they'll be named, or maybe by 9 o'clock, they'll be named Steve Bannon and Kash Patel, and they may be running the FBI. Those are the shiny objects. But the movement is propelled by this hatred of the Democratic Party and the media elites, but also a promise to deliver on the economy, on immigration. And the people in charge of those two things, one of them is an alleged child sex trafficker, and the other is, by her own telling, a dog killer. I mean, the competence may be where he gets sort of bollocksed up.
I think that the idea of the authoritarian promise is that everything shrivels in government other than the will of the leader, right? So you don't necessarily put a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of HHS because you're hoping for great things from HHS. I mean, Matt Gaetz, among all the other things we can say about Matt Gaetz, he has explicitly proposed abolishing the Justice Department, not specifically just abolishing the FBI and the ATF, but talking about abolishing the Justice Department. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, as the Director of National Intelligence, the idea that Tulsi Gabbard, in a normal circumstance, could get a security clearance to be like a Walmart-style greeter at any U.S. intelligence agency, let alone get past the security barriers, is insane. So you do that because you want the worst for these agencies, because you want the worst for the U.S. government, because you think that the U.S. government is worthless. That's part of consolidating power, to make the U.S. government nothing other than the leader and people who will do what he says. And there not being any repository of expertise, let alone, just general day-to-day know-how anywhere. So it's a sort of, I mean, as Steve Bannon used to say, it's a sort of Leninist project, right? Destroy the state. This is the cabinet that you nominate to not to run the U.S. government to do anything, but to destroy the U.S. government, so that the U.S. government can be fundamentally reimagined as something much more like a unitary, authoritarian, or autocratic, for lack of a better term, system.
What are you looking at as the friction points? I mean, in the first Trump presidency, it was the firing of Jim Comey after he refused to, quote, see to it to let Mike Flynn go. Let Mike Flynn go. Comey says no. Trump embarks on a 4-year-long crusade against the FBI and the Department of Justice. To your point, Matt Gaetz is going to be in charge of the department, and an as yet named person expected to replace his last handpicked head of the FBI, Christopher Wray. He's sort of threatened Jerome Powell, who said it's illegal for him to replace me. I mean, where do you expect any friction between Trump 2.0 and the institutions that stand?
Well, the first one is going to happen over the question not of the appointment of any particular nominee, not of the confirmation process for any particular nominee, but whether there will be a confirmation process for nominees, right? The first point of confrontation is going to be between Trump and the Republican-controlled Senate, and it's going to be over the basic question of whether or not the Senate has any role in confirming any of these nominees, right? Trump will have to go to very arcane, very, very unusual and untested corners of the Constitution and precedent to find any way that he can shut down the House and the Senate himself. He's going to tell Republicans in Congress to shut themselves down, thus marginalizing themselves as one of the three supposedly co-equal branches of government so that he can set up the executive branch himself without anybody having a say about it. Now, why would you want to do that rather than just have all of your nominees confirmed by the Senate, which I'm sure the Republicans in the Senate would be happy to do? You want them not to have a role in the confirmation process because you want the legislative branch to shrivel. You want the legislative branch to go away because what authoritarians do is they consolidate power both within the executive and then in the person of the authoritarian leader. And so that's why it's an advantage to get a recess appointment rather than a Senate confirmed appointment, even if he's guaranteed Senate confirmation for even the craziest of these folks. And I think that confrontation will be first as to whether or not Congress essentially folds and becomes something like what Troy Nehls wants rather than what the founders intended, which was a co-equal branch of government that has a say in how we run the place.
President-elect Trump is naming Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be his health secretary. This tees up another major clash in these new cabinet wars, this one between medical science and a notoriously unreliable political activist with no serious experience as a doctor or a federal government official. Kennedy's links here are more political than medical. That is kind of the first most important thing anyone should know if you're only catching up with this now. RFK Jr. ran an extremist and long-shot presidential campaign, which basically traded on his family's legacy name in a far-gone era of Democratic politics. And he traded that in to cozy up to Donald Trump after he dropped out of a race that was clearly unwinnable for many different reasons. Kennedy used his platform and fame to push discredited attacks on vaccines and other medical science. And let me be clear with you up front as we follow the facts together. Like other moves that Donald Trump, the president-elect, is making this week, this is exactly what he said he would do. Now, there may be some Republicans and independents and other Wall Street leaders who have kept claiming, even in public, even on the record, that they didn't expect this, or they didn't hear Trump, or it wouldn't be like this. But I want to be clear with you. Donald Trump vowed before Election Day that he was going to let RFK Jr., quote, go wild on health, fully knowing the fact-free and sometimes deceitful and lying and conspiracy theory-riddled rhetoric of RFK Jr. This is not a person who has distinguished himself in medical science or factual work or journalistic reporting about science. That's just not who he is or was. Now, like other Trump picks this week, the issue here is not exactly right or left, red or blue, or traditional debates over policy, which, of course, are a valid part of the shift anytime you have a new incoming government, especially when the parties change. This is something else, and we will continue to clearly, soberly, accurately, and calmly report on it for you. But we will also be clear and blunt in what's happening. This is, through President-elect Trump's choices, the very direct weakening and mocking of government posts by proposing to fill them with figures who are already publicly on the record opposing the very departments they seek to run and the very work of those departments. So you put someone anti-science who has been completely fact-checked by every major medical authority to allegedly oversee those same medical authorities. You put a partisan warrior in charge of a department where the main qualification is a nonpartisan administration of the law. Kennedy's baseless claims have included things like falsely saying Wi-Fi causes cancer. It does not. That it causes, quote, leaky brain, which is not a medical term. That school shootings are all caused by antidepressants, which is flatly false and can be, of course, discredited by any international comparison of the various issues. That chemicals in the water make children automatically transgender. No medical science supports the water link theory there, if you want to call it a theory. And he has said, again, not a doctor, not a scientist, but he is out here getting ready to try to take over control of some of these agencies that are related, he has claimed, quote, AIDS may not be caused by HIV. The falsehoods continue.
There's 25% of Americans who believe that they know somebody who was killed by a COVID vaccine.
Killed?
Killed. 25% of Americans.
You would seek to ban fluoride in the U.S. water supply?
I think fluoride is on its way out. I knew in May of 2020 that the vaccines were not going to protect against transmission because I was actually reading the monkey studies. They asked me why I wasn't wearing a mask. They said, wasn't I scared of dying of COVID? And I said to them, there's a lot worse things than dying. And they said to me, like what? And I said, like living like a slave.
This affects you. This affects your safety. If you have family, older, younger, parents, children, this affects their safety. If you are the more informed person in your community, then you will be someone who can do something positive, citizen to citizen, person to person, parent to parent, dealing with what will come out of this. And again, I want to be clear and I want to repeat it. This is not an ideological thing. We've covered the debates over lockdowns on this program. There were reasons that different government policies ran into different opposition over time, and you debate that out respectfully. There are valid differences of opinion on those policy matters. But what you just heard there and what I just showed you about many false statements about science and medicine, armed with government power, is dangerous. This is not just about whether you look at something online and find it false or laugh it off. We are talking about the administrative federal powers over medicine, hospitals, nurses, science. The Centers for Disease Control chief has already warned prior to today's news that RFK's misinformation from a place of power is dangerous to the public. The concern about RFK potentially getting through the Senate confirmation process, once unthinkable, by the way, is roiling the FDA, current and former health officials, and others trying to make sense of this. When RFK Jr. ran for president, more of this was on display. And as I've mentioned to you on this program, we try to give you the news and the facts and bring people on to discuss it. So it's not about censoring or disappearing things. And so we took time out to have a taped interview with RFK Jr. and discuss many issues with him. One of the things that came across then, when he claimed to be an independent candidate, but also was cozying up to Trump, was the mix of outright combativeness that he has for really the way a lot of these things work in the government, the way medical science and doctors and other people who sometimes risk their lives in hospitals take care of people, the kind of vitriol he had for them, and an intense confidence about everything that he wanted to do, and later he said Trump would let him do.
I've litigated against almost every one of the major federal agencies. I've sued CDC, NIH, EPA, FDA, USDA. I'm going to issue an executive order that any government official that lies to the American public in conjunction with his federal duties will be dismissed. And I'm going to issue an executive order stopping the intelligence agencies from propagandizing the American public.
That's who Trump is proposing to be in charge of these things. And in the Orwellian nature of people lying and then accusing others of lies, notice how he's proposing to control things. RFK Jr., in his statement there, his own words, would be the person in charge of what is true and a lie. And then the people who didn't agree with his truth about science or his suppositions about how HIV and AIDS work or leaky brain, then he says he would use government power to fire, to oust, to purge all those people. This is not a drill. These selections this week by President-elect Trump are quickly undercutting the pre-election claims that we heard from Republicans and certain conservative GOP apologists who were arguing that a Trump second term would be a way to advance competent conservative policy. False. Or it would be a way to move on from Trump's more extreme vows in campaign season once the campaign was over. False, based on the personnel decisions we are getting tonight. It is precisely the opposite. Just as Trump promised, these picks for these important posts, we are talking about the Pentagon and the Justice Department and the hospital oversight around the entire country. Just as he promised, these picks attack the foundation of competent, independent government. These are picks that are quite obviously and deliberately, and for him, unsurprisingly, sending out the shockwaves, because these are people who are inexperienced, partisan, and again, as respectfully as I can say it, quite fringe and outlandish. The repercussions are in the real world, from hospitals to battlefields around the world, to how prosecutors will approach the citizenry when the Trump administration lawfully accepts these powers January 20th. Take the Attorney General nominee, Matt Gaetz. His vows to abuse power in order to attack Trump and perhaps his own enemies, that can cause as much pain on Wall Street as on K Street in D.C. And so let me show you something right now. The same conservatives who publicly and loudly rooted Donald Trump on over at the Wall Street Journal's conservative opinion section, now on this matter, they already have second thoughts, coming out against Gaetz, opposing him for Attorney General, saying he's a nominee only for those who want law used for political revenge, and it won't end well. These Wall Street conservatives are correct that Gaetz has vowed such revenge. That's not in dispute. We still live in a factual world, and that is the fact. But knowing that Gaetz has vowed such revenge doesn't separate the Wall Street Journal or these other Trump supporters from the fact that their candidate Trump also has vowed such revenge quite clearly and repeatedly. This is the feature, not a glitch. Now, there are Republicans who clearly view Gaetz as a particularly bad, politically vulnerable version of carrying out that plan, but it is the plan. Going into a vetting of Gaetz or trying to even stop him from becoming this official, running DOJ, if Republicans find the votes to do that, that could send a message about some kind of line. But the rule of law will require more than simply stopping a personnel decision like Matt Gaetz. It will have to stop President-elect Trump's unlawful demands. And anyone who knows anything about history and autocracy, and Rachel and Nicole, my colleagues, were discussing this just in the last few hours, knows that you can start that battle when you meet it, or you can wait around and when you're forced into it, face it in an even weaker condition. Trump's own allies say that he passed on AG candidates who were acting like they were applying for some kind of, quote, judicial appointment, said clearly with derision. Quote, they talked about their vaunted legal theories and constitutional bull. One insider told the Bulwark. Matt Gaetz was the only one who said, yeah, I'll go over there and start cutting effing heads. Former Congressman Gaetz' public record includes demands to hijack the government and abuse DOJ powers for what has always been, and unless the Supreme Court makes another change in the law, what is still today the abuse of government authority for unlawful retribution vendettas.
Ken's latest reporting is entitled Justice Department Employees Stunned at Trump's Insane, Unbelievable Choice of Matt Gaetz for Attorney General.
So, Jake, let's start with you and get the reporting of it. I mean, you were on the Hill yesterday, obviously, when the news came and the news broke. We've been talking this morning. I certainly been talking this morning about how, I mean, it not only doesn't serve the Justice Department or the Republicans, it doesn't serve President Trump because, as so many people have said, this is the least qualified pick ever to be Attorney General. What were you hearing from Republicans on the Hill after this news broke?
Well, Joe, if they could muster anything to say, which many of them were actually shocked beyond words, they were saying that they weren't going to confirm him in so many words. I mean, we got calls last night from senior Senate Republicans who vowed they will do everything in their power to make sure Matt Gaetz does not get confirmed. A few thoughts here. Number one, it is a healthy Senate Republican majority. 53 seats you could do a lot with. You could get pretty much anyone within reason you want confirmed. confirmed. This is not within reason for many Republican senators. You have Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Mitch McConnell, remember, is no longer in leadership and is a free agent. Those will be the people that I'm watching, on top of many, many more Senate Republicans who think Matt Gaetz is despicable, a joke. You know, he's pretty reviled up here. That's number one. Number two, you know, if Trump keeps doing this, there's two direct impacts. Number one, he is losing his House Republican majority. It's crazy to say that. He is going to nominate the House Republicans into the minority if he's not careful. Mike Johnson said last night, I've told him it's enough already. You can't keep nominating House Republicans for administration positions, or else we will be in the minority and you will no longer have all branches of government. That's number one. Number two, if he puts forward these picks that are so problematic, it's going to just eat up valuable Senate time. And a lot of Republicans complained that the first 100 days of the last Trump administration were wasted, and that is true. They didn't get much done in those first 100 days, and they want to take advantage of these 100 days. If you waste your time on stunts like this, you're going to just be really behind the eight ball in getting an actual agenda enacted, which he may or may not care about, but traditional presidents would care about that.
So Jake, do you think you had said stunt, and I'm curious because I've heard from several people on the Hill that they thought that this was Donald Trump either I don't know if you call it punking the Hill or just trolling, maybe trolling, but you would call it a stunt. Several others suggested last night, Republicans, that this wasn't a serious pick. He has to know it's not going to pass through, and he's doing it for other reasons. Have you heard that? And if so, what other reasons could there be?
Beats me. I mean, I don't see a reason to do something like this. I mean, Joe, you served with a president who was very good on Capitol Hill. Bill Clinton would give a heads up to members of his party when he was going to put forth a nomination that could be controversial. He didn't do that here. So what's the effect? Maybe the next person, it softens the ground for the eventual attorney general. Maybe it makes his other picks look more palatable. I couldn't tell you what the president-elect is thinking in any way, shape, or form. All I can tell you is that Matt Gaetz will probably not get 50 votes in the Senate. I mean, I don't know what is behind this. It certainly, according to everyone that we've talked to, seems like a stunt and an unnecessary one at that.
All right, Ken Delanian, a lot of folks, when we talk to Jake and to others on their great reporting on the reaction to these nominations, specifically Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, it does feel like they're speaking in a reality that involves a Senate and a functioning government, House and a Senate that actually wants to get something done, have an agenda, and has plans to be productive. But if we look at what Donald Trump had promised, had tried to do in his first presidency, and had promised to do repeatedly during his campaign, don't these nominations fit?
Well, they certainly do, Mika.
Right.
One of the things he's promised to do is to prosecute his political enemies, to blow up the FBI, which he views as corrupt, to purge the Justice Department of career civil servants who won't hew to his views of the world. And Matt Gaetz is exactly the kind of person, probably the personification of the kind of figure that could try to do that. I will just say one thing, though, about Jake's analysis, that could this be a way to make the next nominee look more palatable? I just remember back in 2019 when John Ratcliffe, who's now going to be the next CIA director, was nominated to be the DNI, and he was not confirmed. He had to withdraw his nomination amid some controversies that he had lied about his background and some other things. And then Rick Grinnell was installed as the acting DNI, which was seen as a nightmare inside the intelligence community. And after a few months of Rick Grinnell, John Ratcliffe seemed a lot more palatable, and he was confirmed by the Senate. So is that what's going on here? I mean, I think that's a reasonable question to ask, assuming that Matt Gaetz is not confirmable. But just taking it at face value, look, I mean, there is a human trafficking prosecution unit within the Justice Department, and some of those people may have worked on the investigation of Matt Gaetz, and now they are confronted with the idea that he could be their boss. He could control their fates. They are absolutely horrified. I mean, look, we talk to political appointees at the Justice Department all the time. I've been talking more to the career public servants. And first of all, before all this happened, there was no plan for them to engage in mass resignations because Donald Trump was elected. They are perfectly capable of changing policy on a dime and pursuing the policies of a Republican president, which involves like different priorities on civil rights investigations of police departments, maybe antitrust, all sorts of things. But this set of nominations, and particularly Matt Gaetz, has really caused a lot of people over there to think hard about whether they can continue inside the Justice Department. And that may be what the Trump administration wants, right? But yeah. It is I've never heard the kind of comments, and some of which we published in our story, that people are saying right now. They are just unmoored. They are flabbergasted and really, really scared, guys.
So, Dave Arenberg, let's get your take on this, your perspective, how this nomination is resonating throughout the sort of legal and law enforcement community, and also speak to the idea that this is what Trump has always sort of wanted. He prizes personal loyalty. We know that in the first term, he famously asked for his own Roy Cohn. Maybe he thinks Matt Gaetz can be that.
Jonathan, yeah, Trump always wanted his attorney general to be his personal defender, and he holds Roy Cohn as the ideal lawyer. So it's not a surprise he wanted someone like Matt Gaetz. I am surprised, and I think others are, that he actually picked Matt Gaetz. We knew he'd pick a MAGA warrior, but Matt Gaetz has become a caricature of a MAGA warrior. It's not just that he was nearly prosecuted for child sex trafficking. It's also that he was nearly expelled from Congress and could have been expelled if he stayed around. And with this pick, Trump is trolling the DOJ and the rule of law, but it could have devastating consequences. You asked about perception. Well, a Republican friend of mine who's also friends with Matt Gaetz told me last night he thought this appointment was the worst thing that's ever happened to the country. And considering a country that went through the Civil War, the Great Depression, and 9/11, that's quite a statement. This pick is so shocking and so unserious that I do think he'll have a hard time getting confirmed. So that sound you hear is Kevin McCarthy working the phones right now to try to defeat his top enemy, or else he could become in the sights of the DOJ. Now, I think there could be a recess appointment here, which would allow Gaetz to serve for up to 2 years. So it's up to John Thune, the new majority leader. And we're going to see soon enough if he will be known as a man who loves his country, like Mike Pence, or whether his legacy will be the guy who watches as Rome burns.
Amidst all these seeming controversies, it is needful to hold on to a fact that if these people are permitted under the law to serve, why not sit back and watch how things unfold? After all, United States of America is a democratic nation where the principle of checks and balances is upheld. Thank you for watching.